Any questions about anything?
Matthew, so talking about the laws, and I'm trying to understand. So there are Old Testament laws, New Testament laws. So how?
Correct. In the Old Testament, there were laws that were dogmatic. In other words, they're unchanging. A dogma never changes. It just is, such as God is Trinity. That's a dogma. But also moral laws are dogmatic. Like, for instance, do not commit adultery. It's a moral law. And it's just as true now as it was in Old Testament times. Do not murder. Honor your father and mother. The 10 Commandments, they're dogmatic laws, which means they're unchanging and forever, included in the New Testament. Now, Jesus Christ refined the understanding of these laws especially in his Sermon on the Mount. And I think we've already been through that, haven't we? No, we didn't. We're coming to that soon. Like, for instance, when he says, it has been said of old that you should not murder. I say to you, if you even say to your brother, Raca, you're liable to the judge, to the Sanhedrin, to the judgment. And if you say, you fool, you're liable to, I don't remember how it quotes it exactly. I don't want to misquote it. But he's saying that it's not just murder that law said, that commandment said not to do or forbade, but also it is even to be hateful. Because hatred is like murder. Or lust, to look at a woman to lust after her, or for that matter, at a man to lust after him, is to commit adultery. Whereas the Jews thought adultery was only the physical act of adultery. The law is the same, but the understanding of it is refined in the New Testament. And in general, I would say all the commandments are like that of the Old Testament. They were understood in a more superficial way. And we understand them in a much deeper, more spiritual way. But there are also rules and regulations in the Old Testament, which would be considered to be under the so-called Old Testament law. Did I say New Testament? I meant to say Old Testament. In the Old Testament, there are rules and regulations that are no longer applicable to now. For instance, the one to be a Jew, to be circumcised. It's not necessary for a Christian boy to be circumcised because circumcision is a type of baptism. It reminds us, points to baptism. Well, once you have the thing fulfilled, the thing that the type points to, you don't need a type anymore, right? I mean, if I have directions to my house so people can come for a party, and I invited 10 people, and they're all here, I could take the signs down. You don't need them anymore. They're superfluous. So in the same way that Old Testament laws that point towards the new are no longer necessary. Doing the Passover by having a lamb that has not been broken, the legs have not been broken, and it's been roasted with fire, and you eat it all in the evening, and you eat it standing with your loins girt. All those things that were necessary for the Passover of the Jews, we have our Passover now, our final Passover. Who is the final Passover? Christ. Christ is the final Passover. And Pascha and Passover are the same word, by the way, the Greek word for Passover. So we don't need to celebrate a Jewish Passover because we have the Christian, if we want to put it this way, Passover, would be celebrating the Eucharist. It's not really the Jew-Christian Passover, but it's sort of, we, instead of celebrating a memorial meal, a commemoration meal, once a year, like the Jews did for Passover, we have a commemoration meal, which is actually a meal of the body and blood of Christ every single day. In a monastery every day, in our parish 4 times a week, 5 times this week. There are laws and regulations in the Old Testament that are no longer applicable, such as another one is not to eat unclean animals. Well, in the New Testament, in Acts, it made it pretty clear from the vision of Peter that everything's clean. You want to eat pig? Go ahead. I mean, you even want to eat pig's feet? Go ahead. I think they're gross, but you can eat them. if you want to, take them out and there's all that gelatin around them and everything. It's disgusting. But you could eat them if you want to eat them. If you want to eat pig's feet, go ahead. If you want to eat alligator, you can. If you want to eat shrimp, you can. It's not an unclean food in the New Testament. It was unclean in the Old Testament. So there are those regulations, but there are also moral laws, and the moral laws haven't changed. Don't commit adultery. The moral laws about sexual depravity, they're identical. They haven't changed. People would like to say they've changed because now we eat shrimp. So now that we can have shrimp, we can have moral depravity. The two are not at all the same. One is regulation for the Jewish people at the time because they were being led to a better way, a better understanding with Christ coming. And then the other is a moral way of life. It's immoral to do sexual depravity. Just so it's always been a law, and it always will be. Is that enough, or is there still?
No. That was deep enough. What struck me is reading Old Testament versus New Testament, and not the disconnect, but the difference, right? Like sixth day, right? When Jesus healed someone on Saturday, right?
Right. It was that was really amazingly foolish of them to be trying to say that he broke the law, because Jesus made it very clear: is it on the Sabbath? Is it good to do good or to do ill? Everybody knows. A child knows that on the Sabbath and on every other day, it is good to do good and not to do evil. Period. And anybody who has an ox, or I think they had an ox or an ass, or a sheep or a goat or something. I think a sheep or an ass that falls into the ditch. What are you going to do? You're going to get in the ditch and get the animal out, because otherwise the animal's going to die. What if your child breaks a leg? What are you going to do? Not treat the child until the next day? Well, of course. The law of love supersedes. I shouldn't say supersedes. The law of love informs everything.
So it's more about following the spirit of
the letter of the law versus the spirit,
right?
Well, we always follow the spirit of the law. Now, if you're able to follow the letter of the law, and there's nothing stopping you, then yes, follow the letter of the law. For instance, in fasting. On a given day, don't eat meat, cheese, eggs, olive oil, alcohol, because it's a fast day. But if there's some reason, a rational, good reason why you should maybe eat something that's not fasting on that day, being pregnant, she's pregnant, she should eat non-fasting foods on all days. Meat and cheese and eggs, absolutely. She's not breaking the fast. Or if somebody gives you hospitality, you go to your grandmother's house and she makes you your favorite croissants because you love them as a kid. Your grandmother's 92 years old and she's looking at eternity just about. You're going to say, "Grandmother, I'm fasting, remember? Don't you remember?" She's going to say, "No, stupid, I'm 92. and I love you, so eat the stupid croissants." Right? That's what you should do, right? See? So it's not breaking the fast in that case, to eat the croissants in that case. So we have to inform everything we do with love. And I made a mistake when I first said love supersedes. Love doesn't supersede the law. Love informs the law. So if you are a Jew and your ox falls into the pit on the Sabbath, then of course love would mean that you take care of the ox, or take care of a child, or any other particular need. Person needs healing on the Sabbath, love would inform you that absolutely a person should be healed on the Sabbath. Positively. Can't think of a better thing to do on the Sabbath than cause a blind man to see or a crippled man to walk. Of course. So, love informs everything. And we don't live according to letter. We do the letter if we're able to. I mean, we serve the services very completely in our church. There's a few things that we do a little shorter for the sake of, because in a parish situation, it's very hard to ask everybody to have the endurance of a monastic. So our services are about maybe less than an hour shorter than a monastic service might be in the same circumstance for vigil. But our service is very complete. The vigil service is very complete. And we don't cut corners, because we serve according to the letter as best we can. And even then, there's modifications that I as a pastor have the right to make. I have the authority to say, we'll say 3 psalms instead of the whole Catechism this time. Just because we're trying to make sure that people are not, falling out at 9 o'clock in the evening. It's a little different. Monastic situation's a little different. And you have to have the intelligence to know. Parish priest needs to be intelligent enough to know that the people in his church are not monks. Now, I'm going to talk about monasticism a lot, and I'm going to want to teach you about monastic ways, etc. Monastic morality, absolutely. But practically, everything that a monk does, no, because we're not monks. So we don't live as monks. We don't have the same things that they do. Anything else about the Old Testament law or anything else? That's a good question. It's a good question. But just make sure love informs everything. I will tell you a story. Father Zechariah once given a talk. He's a wonderful man. He's from the line of Father Silouan, Father Sophrony, and he's the spiritual son of Father Sophrony. And they're just wonderful, and their books are amazing. He was giving a talk, and he said something, and there was something about obedience and something about rules and regulations. And he said, in my monastery, we have very few rules and regulations because of love, we just don't need it. Because of love, you shouldn't need a rule or regulation that, clean up the toilet when you leave it. Kind of makes sense. You should, because you're leaving a mess for somebody else, right? Mm-hmm. So there shouldn't be a law. You don't need one. Unfortunately, because people are what they are, you have these notes saying, when you take the last cup of coffee, make another pot. Or your mother doesn't live here, clean your own dishes, stuff like that. But if people were always attuned to living according to love, nobody would need to tell them to clean their own dishes. In fact, they would not only clean their own dishes, they'd clean the other dishes that are there without complaint. That's the kind of way we should live. So any other questions?
What's a appropriate relationship to have with saints and our patron saints?
We should look to our patron saint, if we know something about him or her, as our guide in terms of how they live their life. And we should pray to them every day for sure. You should definitely make prostrations to your saint. Maybe 3 prostrations every day or something like that. Holy Saint Seraphim, pray to God for me. And you should definitely pray to your saint. And you should celebrate your saint's name's day. If it's at all possible, you should ask the priest, say, would you celebrate liturgy on that day? And, service the night before. But sometimes, you might have to be the one that serves that sings or something. You have to sometimes you have to give back in order to have it happen. But you certainly should celebrate your name's day every year by prayer and giving alms. You can pray canons and akathis to your saint if they exist. Certainly do prostrations and ask your saint to pray for you every day. And if you have a very close relationship with your saint, if you're really spiritually attuned, then talk to him or her. The saints did. St. John Maximovich was going around sensing. He would talk to saints, and he'd stop at the icon and say, Father John, this image it doesn't really look like you, does it? You really had more hair than that or something. I mean, because he saw the saint. So he had visions and things. So he was very familiar with the saints, but always in a worshipful and a very, very respectful way. But he was familiar with them just as you'd be familiar with your grandfather. Okay, so let's move on to Matthew, the verse before that we talked about. Do not begin to think that I came to abolish the law or the prophets. I came not to abolish but to fulfill. For verily I say to you, until heaven and the earth shall have passed away, one iota or one tittle in no wise shall pass away from the law, until all shall have taken place. So a iota or a tittle is just a tiny little marking, diacritical marking. So obviously nothing's going to pass away. And this word till indicates forever, until all have taken place. One jot or tittle of the law will not pass away until all have taken place. That doesn't mean when everything's taken place, you forget the law. doesn't mean that after Jesus was born, Joseph knew Mary. He did not know Mary till the birth, which is indicating forever. Till is often indicates forever. Sometimes it does. I'm gonna work until 10 o'clock, then I'm gonna go home. That's clear that it's not forever. But if you say a lot of things, I'll love you till the stars fall from the sky. Well, obviously you're saying you're gonna love someone forever. So that's one thing. Blessed Theophylact says that some say that the iota and the tittle signify the 10 commandments of the law, and others say they indicate the cross, because the iota is like the upright beam of the cross. It's kind of vertical. And the accent is the transverse beam. Not quite horizontal, but kind of. So you put them together, it looks like, a cross that a 3-year-old draws. And therefore Christ is saying that everything that was spoken concerning the cross will be fulfilled, is what he's basically saying. I say to you, until heaven and earth shall have passed away, in other words, forever, one iota or one tittle shall no wise pass away from the law until all shall have taken place.
Father, would you say that when else, the Greek word for until, is used, that if we don't expect the opposite, the thing that's till to happen, for example, when the stars fall from the heavens, we don't expect that we don't know when that's going to happen, if it is going to happen. I will be always until the end of the age. Well, we don't know when that's going to happen. We don't, and in those circumstances, the word eos would take on a forever,
absolutely,
kind of feeling. But when you say, I'm going to go home at 10, we know that's going to happen.
Right.
We know when that is.
But it occurs in other cases too. For instance, knew not Mary till she gave birth. Well, we know that he didn't know Mary after she gave birth either. Nobody in their right mind would know Mary after she's born the God-man Jesus Christ. I mean, what an incredible responsibility it would be to be the protector of that family. I don't think you'd really be wanting to start another family with your wife at that point.
See, the reason, though, that I would look at that situation with Mary and until after she gave birth is that her entire marital situation with Joseph was it could never happen. It wouldn't ever happen because of his age.
Yeah, it was
Their
that
whole
was definitely
marital
a
situation.
definitely a December-May marriage kind of thing. I mean, he was 85 years old,
Right.
and God knew, of course, that he would live until Jesus was publicly preaching, or just before his public preaching. He lived until 105.
Wow.
So he lived until Jesus was 30. Then Jesus entered into his public ministry, and he died just before the public ministry began. What an incredible humility, He didn't take care. He didn't do any of the really fancy stuff. He just took care of protecting the family.
Mary was really young, wasn't she? She was only like 18.
Oh, younger than that.
Wow.
Yeah, because she would have to leave the temple when she would start menstruating. Women could be, girls, virgins, could be in the temple, or women past menopause could be in the temple and take care of things. But especially the virgins. But of course, anyone who's a virgin at 10, well, they're going to go through puberty. And then, of course, they're going to bleed. And the bleeding was ritually impure. And so a woman couldn't be bleeding in the temple precincts. When they're a certain age, they think, okay, we got to get them out of here now because they're going to go through puberty. So she was probably, some people think she might have been 12, some people say 15. She was definitely not 18. Now puberty would be a little bit later in those days. I mean, they weren't eating plastic like we do, et cetera, et cetera. So their nutrition was not the same as ours. Whosoever shall break one of the least of these commandments and shall teach men so, he shall be called least in the kingdom of the heavens. He calls the commandments, which he's about to give, to be the least of these things, out of humility. So he's going to give a lot of commandments. If you break the least of these things, in other words, the stuff I'm teaching you, you're liable. But he just says it in a very sort of self-deprecating way. And notice the requirement that we must do and teach the commandments. Just teaching them, that's not going to cut it. You have to teach, you have to do them. Because if you don't do them, then you're really teaching not to do them. So there's a heavy responsibility. If we call ourselves a Christian, then we must live in a certain way, because otherwise people look at us and say, Christians, they're terrible. And that would be a terrible thing if someone leaves the church or never comes to the church because we have acted in an unbecoming way. And they have been angry at the church because of that. So there's a great responsibility to live carefully. And certainly, that sounds to me like faith without works is dead. James said that. Luther didn't like that. He wanted to get rid of James. He wasn't successful. Because James didn't fit his narrative, did it? Because it says, faith without works is dead. What else do you need? What about that sentence don't we understand? Faith without works is dead. So teaching about the law but not doing it, that's dead. And teaching against the law or living against the law, that's dead. That's definitely dead. Whoever shall do and teach them, this one shall be called great in the kingdom of the heavens. There is doing and there is teaching. A person can teach by doing, but we must concentrate on doing before we can actively teach with our mouths. You are learning the faith. All of us are learning the faith. We best be careful that we don't consider ourselves to be great teachers. That's what Arius did, and that's what Macedonius did, and all the rest that were great arch heretics. They thought themselves puffed up, and so they taught things that were beyond their understanding, and they lapsed into heresy. And in the case of Arianism, Arianism wasn't just a heresy. Arianism became a political movement, and people were killed. People were martyred. People were tortured because of Arianism and because of iconoclasm. So these were not just false ideas. These were completely against the law of love. Because certainly, killing or torturing somebody because you don't agree with them, there's no place in the Bible that talks about doing that.
Isn't that the part of the history of the church?
What do you mean?
Well, like Orthodox Church, and when it came to Russia, there was it came with the struggle, right? It came with the struggle, and it was to some extent forced on the people too.
Yes, well, the church is full of sinners, right? So the church has struggled both from within and from without. There have been enemies of the church in the church, heretics, usurpers of power, bishops or emperors that wanted to take power and stomped over anybody that they could in order to obtain their objective. There's always been that. But there's also been, the church has been obviously persecuted from without, from enemies without. It's a hard thing to understand. I mean, the church is the body of Christ, and it's the bride of Christ, without spot or wrinkle. And yet we see a lot of spotted and wrinkled people in the church. It's a very difficult thing to understand. And I think I talked about that in an oblique way in the sermon today. We see things and we say, that's what this means. Well, maybe it doesn't. The church has sinners in it. So there are people who can represent themselves, even bishops that represent themselves as speaking for the church when actually they're speaking for themselves. A lot of that's going on now. The terrible heresies that are being promulgated by some bishops in the church. They're not representatives of the truth. Go ahead.
Quick question. When you say the church, is that within Eastern Orthodoxy, or does that include people outside Eastern Orthodoxy?
Only Eastern Orthodoxy.
Okay.
So for us, the church there's one church. I believe in one baptism for the remission of sins. So there's one baptism, there's one valid baptism for the church, and it's in the church only. Outside of that, there are people that believe very similarly to people in the Orthodox Church. There are people that are more virtuous than people in the Orthodox Church. There are people who pray, who do good works. May God save them. But we would not consider them to be in the church. What God does with them, I'm certain that God will do the absolutely perfectly right thing with them. But we don't say that they're in the church. Now, I guess this is a time to talk a little bit about the ecumenism of our day and the so-called baptismal theology. That's a kind of a new term. In Rome, now they're all in for this, baptismal theology. It took them over a century to get there. Over a century. Their own people, especially a century ago, were aghast that anyone was talking about this stuff. They were the certain avant-garde bishops that were into this. Often there was a whiff of immorality about it all, and the tried and true Roman Catholic theologians squashed it. But they kept coming back, and eventually, because people are so weak spiritually, they don't know their faith, they don't practice their faith. I've been told that like half of Roman Catholic women believe that they are pro-choice. How can this be? It's not possible to say you're Catholic and also to be pro-choice. It's a contradiction. Or to be Catholic and be living with your boyfriend and think everything's fine. That's not right, whether you're Catholic or whether you're Orthodox or anything else. But it's a real weakness, a moral weakness. And the moral weakness is present in Orthodoxy too. I'm not just trying to cast shade on the Roman Catholics. But there was much more spiritual strength. Even though Rome was a heretical group 100 years ago, there was still some spiritual strength that kept this baptismal theology from coming out. This multi-headed hydra, this snake. And eventually it's come out now. And now people like Patriarch Bartholomew are 100% behind it. 100%. This is a heresy. The idea is that all Christian faiths possess baptism. It's the one sacrament that everybody has. And they have it, but there's something wrong with some Christian faiths. They're deficient in some way. Maybe they don't recognize a priesthood. So they have a baptism and not a priesthood. Or they don't recognize the Eucharist. So they have baptism and not the Eucharist. Or they have strange beliefs about other things. But they have baptism. Everybody has baptism. So everybody's Christian. It's just that some are more Christian than others. That sort of like reminds me of Animal Farm. You know, the pig, Napoleon, all animals equal, but some animals are more equal than others. Obviously, it's an oxymoron to say more equal. You can't be more equal than something. Just like, by the way, I just saw something I thought was fascinating. I hadn't thought of this. It's a strange term, social distancing. It's an oxymoron. Human beings need to be social, and to distance is not to be social. So and there's a reason why that term is there. That term is there as part of the mind numbing.
Good is bad.
It's newspeak.
Yeah,
It's
War is
newspeak.
peace.
words no longer mean what they mean.
Exactly.
Orwell, 1984.
It's part of an abuse cycle. I saw a very, very good video that I would recommend if I don't recommend that you watch everything, all this stuff, because there's too much. Especially when people are like, this stuff is terrible and this, well, okay, things are terrible. Are you praying or are you just ranting about things being terrible? To understand why some people are so hooked on to a certain narrative, even when that narrative is shaken by evidence, proof, facts, is because they get invested in it. Like being with a bad boyfriend or a really bad, somebody who's abusive. You've got years invested with this person. You've got children with this person. You want that person to be okay, but they're not. So even when they're not okay, you convince themselves, well, they'll change. So it's part of that abuse cycle. I mean, the government, it's like Lucy's football, right? Lucy is always going to pull the football away when Charlie Brown goes to kick it. Every single time. Every single time. And when he gets convinced, oh yeah, she's really going to do it this time, well, she pulls the football away. So that's kind of what's happening in our world today. This kind of craziness to be able to put words like social distance and with a straight face and call it something. I read something, Anthony Fauci, how do you get ready for Thanksgiving? Most people get ready for Thanksgiving by making sure their house is clean, making sure the turkey's defrosted, maybe they need to get cooking oil if they're going to fry it, stuff like that. That's how you get ready for Thanksgiving. And we get ready for Thanksgiving by celebrating liturgy. For him, getting ready for Thanksgiving is everybody should get a booster. And it's safe to have fun on Thanksgiving without a mask as long as you're sure everyone there is vaccinated. If there's anybody not vaccinated, then you should wear a mask. It's insane talking.
Just going back to the Charlie Brown thing, why does Lucy pull the ball away from Charlie Brown? Because she knows he's always going to try to kick it.
She does know, doesn't she? She does know.
I do have a question, kind of on this line. So, say somebody who is like a spiritual father, or gives you advice, right? And they think they're doing a good job, and then like with Oregon, right? For example, he was ordained a priest outside the jurisdiction.
Mm-hmm.
And he himself thought he was doing it right, and everybody else. But where's this line? It's like he also had a lot of good that he brought to the church, right? And then at the same time, he was condemned by the church in a way as well. So
those are mysterious things, my friend. If we can make corrections, we make corrections.
yeah.
If we can't, then we rely on the mercy of God. God is not subject to any of our laws. He's the one who makes the laws. If we can make a correction, we make a correction. I would say that I would hope that I would, if I were found out that maybe, of course, I have a canonical ordination. I was ordained by, Archbishop Alipi, and then I was ordained by Metropolitan Hilarion when he was a bishop. I know their lineage, but let's say somehow I come to some conclusion that I was ordained uncanonically. I should have the courage to go and have my ordination corrected. That doesn't speak and say that, all these baptisms I did were invalid. We got to go and find the 370 baptisms I've done and find it. I don't know. I'm just making up a number. I'm probably
Still alive.
I'm probably inflating it too much. Probably 200 baptisms for sure. I'd say 200 for sure. So 200 baptisms. And find everybody, including in 1995. Right? Serious?
Or married.
Or married them, or had confession and given absolution. God is not bound by these kinds of things. If we can make a correction, we make a correction. And by economy, we would say everything else is.
It seems like reading through the history that without doubt, Oregon had a lot of skills and knowledge, and Pope Demetrius, he was afraid that by becoming a priest, he would have so much more power and influence to where it would be detrimental to him and
right.
as a pride. But at the same time, there's people suggest that he himself was jealous of the knowledge and the skills that Oregon possessed, that he did it out of that way.
It could be. I didn't even know that Origen had ever been ordained.
Yeah, he was a priest in the Antiochian Church. That's why he belonged to Alexandria jurisdiction.
Because Origen self-mutilated himself. He made himself a eunuch.
In the end, yeah.
In the end, okay. So, I actually read in the Lives of the Saints recently there was someone who was made a eunuch, because a eunuch was a thing back then. Parents would have their children be made a eunuch because they could rise up in the ranks. Now, of course, they could die too. The surgery was not 100% effective by any means. But there were still, at some points in time, there were thousands upon thousands of eunuchs. And the one eunuch, he became Patriarch of Constantinople. I wasn't aware that a person who was a eunuch could be ordained. Here, I'll tell you something for breaking the rules. In the life of St. Mary of Egypt. Mm-hmm. She's a prostitute. She's just transacted her business just like usual. Everybody's running to venerate the cross. So she runs to venerate the cross too, because everybody's doing it. Mm-hmm. She comes to this epiphany where she can't go in the church. She's repentant. She promises the Mother of God she will go wherever she wishes her to go. Just let her venerate the cross. She's able to get into the church, venerate the cross. She goes out in like a just an absolute haze. She was in some sort of exalted spiritual state. She was handed the 3 coins. She goes to, walks and walks and walks along the Jordan, comes to a monastery. She has communion. This would be during almost certainly it was the exaltation of the cross, which would be in September, right? September. And she has communion. Now, I guess she probably had confession. Can you imagine the priest that gave her confession? His eyes must have looked like, this big, the things that she was telling him. And it would be usual that if someone has been living as a prostitute for 17 years, I know all these numbers. I just have this life memorized. She lived as a prostitute from the time she was 12 for 17 years. And a priest would say, you have an epithymia, maybe we'd be lenient, 40 days, maybe 2 years, maybe 1 year, and we must be fasting. In those days, we would have penitents that would be standing outside the church and then inside the church a little bit, and then eventually they would be restored to communion. You'd give them some sort of rule. He gave her communion right away. He broke the rules. But it must have been by insight that he did that. It must have been by love informed him. Because then she goes the next morning, gets in a boat. Last time she ever needed a boat to cross a river. Gets in a boat, goes across the Jordan, goes out into the desert, spends 47 years in the desert before she meets Zosimus. Then 1 more year in the desert, and then Zosimus buries her the next year. So he broke the rules. You're not supposed to do that. Somebody comes to me and says they've been living as a prostitute for 17 years. I'm going to kind of make sure that they're really repentant. But he didn't. And I don't think we can justifiably rebuke him for that. Because it's clear that the result was an amazing saint. There are rules.
You're really illustrating what you talked about today. You really are illustrating that sometimes we see things that others around us don't see.
Exactly.
He saw into the heart.
I think that's what happened. I think the priest saw into her heart, recognized. He didn't know there was going to be 47 years in Zosimus and all that. Probably.
Yeah.
But he just knew that this was a real conversion, that she needed the mysteries now, and that she was tender. We don't know what would have happened if he had refused her. She said that when she went into the desert, she had 17 years where she was full of lust. She would have so much lust, she'd tremble on the ground. She'd hear the drinking songs, and she'd remember about all the wine and all the fish and all the meat that she would eat. And the drinking songs would resound in her head. She remembered, as she said, she was very careful, the embraces that she longed for. She'd be on the ground for a day and a night, crying out, until finally that lust would pass away from her. It was certainly demonic. The demons were pushing her. Now, what if she experienced that lust the day after the priest had refused to give her communion? She hadn't gotten across into the desert yet. Right. She's right by town. Maybe there would be no St. Mary. But he had insight. Mm-hmm. And so he's part of that story too. He's sort of an unsung hero. We don't know his name, but he exercised the priestly office perfectly. But he didn't follow the rules. He followed the main rule, right, which is love. So we have to be careful that we're not doing things just because it's a rule. You do things because it's right. Now, in general, the rule's right. And if you don't follow the rule, there's got to be a good reason not to. Such as the case of St. Mary. One of my favorite stories. Some of you might not know the story of St. Mary, and if you don't, then make sure you send me an email and it's on our website, and you should read it. It's amazing. It's just an amazing, amazing story. In my opinion, the greatest story I've ever heard of repentance. She became like an angel, literally like an angel. When she prayed, she'd be above the ground. So I'm losing my place here. Anybody else have anything to say? No? All right. Blaine says, do your prostrations. For I say to you that unless your righteousness, this is number 20. For I say to you that unless your righteousness should exceed more than that of the scribes and Pharisees, in no wise shall ye enter into the kingdom of the heavens. So righteousness here means all of the virtues. So if your righteousness doesn't exceed the Pharisees, then you're not going to go to heaven.
Is that the reference to the, or his opinion on the Pharisees and scribes then, right? Because he
he's-
put them outside of.
Yes, yes. In modern parlance, he's throwing some shade on them for sure. He's saying that they are not righteous. But we also have to be careful. That's one, absolutely. He's comparing us, our righteousness to be better more than the Pharisees, because the Pharisees have no righteousness.
But,
they're full of-
they follow the law.
But they followed the law. Well, they followed the
letter.
appearance of
Yeah.
the law. They didn't really follow the law.
Right.
Hypocrites.
But we have to be careful that this, our Lord's instruction is also telling us don't compare us to other men. So why compare yourself to the Pharisees? That's a dumb thing to do. Why compare yourself even to St. Mary of Egypt? We should compare ourselves to Jesus Christ. He is the standard. He is the standard. So we compare ourselves to Jesus Christ because we're not human yet until we become like Jesus Christ. And we should not compare ourselves to the Pharisees or any other men. You can always find somebody more sinful than you that's done something worse than you. So what? They'll stand or fall before God, and you'll stand or fall before God. You can always find people that have done better things than you. So what? It's you that needs to be concerned about what you do, not about other things, other people. Comparing ourselves to people, whether we think we're better or we're worse, is just a very spiritually toxic practice. We don't do that. We compare ourselves to Christ. And our prayers have plenty of comparisons in there, where we say that we're unworthy of Him and we're dirty and we're unclean, and yet Christ will help us. So you're not trying to measure up to any other human being. I wish everybody could be priest for a day. Everybody gets to be priest for a day.
Oh no.
Priest for a day. And if you're priest for a day in this intellectual exercise, and you hear confessions, and you find out that everybody's about the same. Now, different people have different understandings, there are different messes, etc. But the human condition is the same. And you hear somebody's confession and you think, that's just like me. Maybe it's what I've done before, or maybe it's just that I sense that human weakness, even if it's something I haven't done before. That I'm thinking, yeah, given the certain circumstances, I could do that too. So if you're a priest for a day, you start to come off your high horse, and you really know that you're not better than anybody. You're just like everybody else. Everybody's struggling. Everybody's weak. Some people are maybe a little more advanced in the spiritual life, or a lot more advanced. They have more self-control or something. Maybe they have the benefit of an upbringing that was not chaotic. My upbringing was, kind of Ozzie and Harriet-like. My parents loved me. My parents took care of me. I never had any trauma in my home. It just didn't happen. They were strict, but they were fair. It was just fantastic. I didn't really know about the ugliness of the human condition until I got to college. And then even out of college. I've told you some of you the story. I got out of college and I started living I can't remember what the name of the street was. But it was a duplex. And the other duplex next door to us, I did some work with the guy who was living there. I did some painting with him and stuff like that. And he was living with his common-law wife. I guess I sort of had a concept of it, but I'd never seen it. Had a common-law wife, and his wife had 2 abortions. I knew the concept of abortion. I never knew anybody had one. And she was just a very peculiar, strange woman. I didn't have the spiritual understanding then. I think if I saw that woman now, I would definitely know something spiritually is really, really, really wrong. But I was 21 years old. I didn't know nothing from nothing. And I remember taking care one time of his children. they had to be out or something in the morning, Saturday morning, whatever. They asked me to come over and, babysit. He had an infant who was maybe 14 months old, something like that, 15 months old. And then he had an older child. And neither one of them hardly made a noise. The 3-year-old didn't talk at all. And it's very strange. 3-year-olds talk a lot. And the baby that was still in a crib, but was able to climb out of the crib and everything, had a diaper that hadn't been changed for forever, and had taken off the diaper and smeared all the feces on the wall. I had no idea about like abusive children or neglect or anything. I never heard of anything like that. Now I would recognize that these were unfit parents. But I didn't recognize it then. What I did was found cleaning supplies, and I cleaned everything off the wall because I couldn't stand the idea of there being all this feces on the wall. And so I literally spent a couple hours cleaning the wall. But I had no idea that people could live like that. Didn't have any idea. Because I had been raised, I'd never seen anything like that. I mean, when my dad got mad at me, which he did, I knew he wasn't going to hit me. He wasn't even going to cuss at me. Now, he might really be mad at me. I might be really in trouble. But it was just a whole different thing than the situation that I saw in sometimes a little glimpse of it in people's lives. I remember a friend of mine. His name was Jeff Hereko. I don't know why I remember his name. And we were going to go to his house and listen to Rush records. And so we get in his house, and he comes in the house, and he starts screaming at his mother every 4-letter word there is. And she's screaming at him every 4-letter word there is. That was bizarre to me. I never ever said anything to my mother, an insulting word, ever. I mean, I got mad. I even shouted. People do that. Never with disrespect. Never calling a name. And she never called me a name. It never, ever happened in all of my life. But this was normal for them. Screaming swear words. And then she's trying to get him to do something. He's blowing her off. And finally we go downstairs in the basement and start listening to Rush records. I'm kind of like going, what just happened? I'm shaking like, what just happened? I'd never seen anything like that in my life. So I have a responsibility, since I was raised in such a way that was stable, to have some of that stability hopefully come through to people who have not been raised in a stable way. I have a responsibility. I'm not any better than anybody because of that, but I have a better foundation. We have responsibilities because of gifts that were given. So I don't want to compare myself to anybody. I'm not better, but I certainly got a better start than a whole lot of people. And I'm very grateful for that. And my mother was Roman Catholic and so-called good Catholic. That was a term back then. A good Catholic meant you went to the Sunday and the days of obligation. You went to church. That was all there was. If you went to those days, you were a good Catholic. My dad believed in the man upstairs, basically. That was the terminology that was used way back when people used oil lamps for light and stuff. He never went to church, or maybe once in a while with her for something. Just had this idea that you can talk to God anywhere, including the golf course. But he taught me morals. He taught me to be true to my word. He taught me to have compassion for people. He taught me to protect people that were not able to protect themselves. So he taught me a lot of things. And I pray for him. I don't know what he really believed. He really didn't ever want to talk to me about it. When I became Orthodox, he thought, it's a little weird. He wasn't really against it per se. It was just like way out of his bandwidth. It's like he didn't understand it at all. It wasn't really important to him. But he laid the foundation for me to become Orthodox. I always wanted to explain that to him. He never got that I'm Orthodox because of the way you raised me, even though you wouldn't know Orthodox from I don't know, anything. He wouldn't even know what Orthodox was. Never heard of it. So, I don't know why I got off of that rabbit trail. But we don't compare ourselves to others in terms of they're worse than us. But if you have benefits because of the way you were raised, or because of your education, or because of your intelligence, or because of your mental stability. You have responsibilities because of that. You're responsible to live in such a way that helps others because you have something other people don't have. And if you were a priest for a day, you'd see that. You'd go, wow, people have a lot of stuff going on. And you'd think, okay, yeah, I got my troubles. There's a lot of people more trouble than me. So it would increase your compassion. You've heard it said to the ancients, thou shalt not commit murder, and whosoever shall murder will be liable to the judgment. So he says this in a kind of oblique way, in an indefinite way. You've heard it said by the ancients. And he's saying it because he's more or less saying, ancients, this is old. This is old stuff, and I'm going to tell you the new stuff. The new stuff will illuminate the old stuff. So don't think in the old way. Don't think about the old wineskin way. Because if you put new wine in old wineskins, what happens?
It goes bad.
Well, it doesn't just go bad. New wine is fermenting wine. Fermenting wine expels carbon dioxide. And if you have old wineskins that are weak, it's going to burst the wineskin. That's the meaning of that. So you don't put new wine, that is the teaching of Jesus Christ, in the old framework of thinking about things, in the old law. It's the ancient way. It's not that it's invalid or wrong or untrue, but your understanding of it is limited, is limiting the true understanding. He's illuminating what the true understanding of the old law was. So that's why he refers to it. It says, you heard it was said to the ancients, thou shalt not murder, and whosoever shall murder shall be liable to the judgment. So he's showing that basically he's about to show us that there's an inner meaning to this commandment that they didn't understand. Be okay to hate somebody. No, it isn't. Just don't murder them. What about slandering somebody? Well, that's a type of murder. There's many kinds of murder, because murder is akin to hatred and derision. And he's about to show us that. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother without just cause shall be liable to the judgment. Now he's saying, I say to you, because he's emphasizing it's by his authority. The prophets never spoke that way. Thus saith the Lord is what the prophets said. They didn't say, I'm telling you. Jesus Christ is the highest prophet and the highest king and our Lord and Savior and God. Therefore, he says, I say to you. So he's speaking very emphatically here. And probably any Jew that knew the law would see that right away. And those who were following Jesus, those who had seen that he was not like other men, would be impressed by that kind of language. Those who hated Jesus, who felt threatened by him, would find that kind of language to be sort of provocative and actually blasphemous, as if he was usurping God. So he says, I say to you that everyone who's angry shall be, without just cause, shall be liable to the judgment. And that the judgment that he's talking about is, well,
His judgment.
yeah, his judgment. So we have to understand anger. Is it a sin to be angry? Is it always a sin to be angry?
Probably not.
No. You just know me too well, right? When I tell my trick questions, right? Yeah, of course it's not a sin to be angry. God gets angry.
As soon as you say always, it's a trick.
Pretty much.
This could be a trick.
Okay, is it always good to do evil or always good to do good?
Right.
Well, I would say it's always good to do good.
Is it?
So it's not always. You can't get me every time.
Yeah.
There's always an
It's a strong
exception.
indication.
There's always an exception. You know?
So not always, but
Yeah.
always.
Yeah, we should never use absolutes. But
Absolutely.
except when we need to. Except when we need to. So anger is, in the Christian understanding of anger, anger is energy on one level. God has anger. You should have anger. I became a priest because of anger. Anger is energy. You see something's not right and you want to change it. So anger is this energy that motivates you to do what is good, to do what's right. That's the proper use of anger. Anger against sin. But when anger is turned towards another person, then it's misused. You have anger against sin, you have anger against suffering. That's the proper use of anger. But if you have anger against another person, then that's a sin. So in and of itself, anger is not a sin. But the application of anger can be a sin.
Misuse of the instrument.
Exactly. A sword can be used to cut something that you need to cut. Cord or rope or something like that. Or it can be used to kill someone. Raca means basically like, hey you. It's a term of derision. We shouldn't speak to people derisively. I mean, maybe we should criticize them, given what they're talking about, but we shouldn't be derisive. We shouldn't be dehumanizing towards them. So he's connecting murder and anger here. So if you call someone, hey you, if you're showing derision for someone, he's equating that to murder. This was revolutionary. Nobody ever heard of this before. Just don't kill people, but you can be as angry as you want. That, a Jew would probably think that. A Jew wouldn't even think that it's a sin. I still get people that talk to me, and if they're angry at somebody, they feel fully justified to be angry at somebody. You're not justified to be angry, ever. You might be justified to be angry at a situation and want to change it. Go ahead.
It seems like every time I'm angry, it seems like every time I get angry, it's because I'm not able to control the instrument properly based on the situation I'm in. So it's like either I don't have enough of knowledge of the background of something, or it's I'm not able to control my reaction.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like I don't know. It's interesting to observe that afterwards, but it's never kind of fun while you're in it. You tend to make a lot of mistakes. You tend to regret later.
You do.
So what do you do when you're really angry with people like your parents?
What do you do? Well,
Right?
Lane?
I was going to say. Frustrations and prayer.
You pray for people that you're angry at. You absolutely. And the more angry you are, the more you should pray. And you should pray with your blood. And even with your teeth clenched, you should pray. Absolutely. And that's the beginning of forgiving them and not burning with anger. You can't just turn off anger necessarily. You can't just say, I'm not angry anymore. Look, I'm so peaceful. I got totally just messed over by this person. It's okay. I'm not upset at all. Of course you're upset. It's a human emotion. But when that human emotion turns to anger towards a person, as sort of a judgment to a person, where you have thoughts in your head and conversations in your head, which you always win, right? If you have a conversation with somebody who's wrong, you always win. You're always right in that direction. But it doesn't really work that way because they really don't care. People who really just hurt you and don't care, they don't care. And so, or maybe they don't have a capacity to understand how they hurt you or whatever. So you pray for them first. That's the most critical thing. To pray for your enemies and also to pray for your, frenemies, right? Pray for people that are close to you, but they've hurt you. And all of us have had situations like that. And sometimes we live through them for many, many years. What if somebody's hurt you and then they up and die on you? You can't have any correction. They're dead. What are you going to do? You're going to pray for them. Period. Whether they're Orthodox or not, whether they died in a good way or a terrible way, doesn't matter. Pray for them. That's the most critical thing. It's the most critical talent, the most critical skill. Pray for them. And over the course of time, you will actually completely mean what you're saying. It's not hypocritical to pray for somebody when you still feel anger in your heart. I mean, it would be hypocritical to say, I got no problem, it's all good. That's hypocritical. But to recognize your weakness and to pray, absolutely, that's godlike.
So a dialogue with God is what will heal whatever injuries, spiritual or whatnot, we have in as as an effect of our anger, or why we're mad. Pretty much, that's the formula.
A dialogue with God?
Yeah.
I guess you can dialogue with God. Most of the dialogue, I think, should be just praying for the person.
Yeah.
But you could also say, God, forgive me that I'm still so angry at this person. And God, forgive me that I've reached out in horrible ways towards this person. I have a prayer that I basically kind of made up, more or less. It's kind of different every time. Oh, Lord, have mercy upon anyone that I've influenced, anyone that I've harmed, anyone that I've offended, anyone that I could have or should have helped, but because of my own incompetence and my passions and my sins, I did not help. Because there's all those people all over the place. And I don't know, somebody in 1998 that I should have helped and I didn't, or that I interacted with in a way that harmed them. And they're gone now. They've moved to somewhere. I've fallen out of contact with them. But if I know their name, I can pray for them.
First of all, with respect to parents, it's very, very difficult for parents to raise children and not provoke them to some kind of bitterness through provocation over time. It's very difficult, especially in our day and age. Why today is so particular, but maybe 100 years ago this was somewhat rare, but today it's almost ubiquitous. It's everywhere. The second thing is that in order for the child to recover, in their prostrations in prayer for their parents, they have to say as St. Stephen did, forgive them for they knew not what they did. Because they probably don't. They probably think they did the right thing. They probably think that they did the best that they could.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think what happens over time is that the child begins to realize where their parents were coming from. It's almost like an insight. And then they start to relax about what their parents did. And it goes away. The forgiveness actually happens. And I, for one, literally had to tell myself over and over in prayer, I forgive my parents because they do not know what they're doing. They didn't know what they had done to me. And I realized I could never have told them. They wouldn't have understood. It was a foreign language to them. And the scripture that gripped me though was honor your father and mother. It didn't say if they were good to you. It didn't say if you had a great childhood. It said honor your father and mother. So I began to do that, and the true healing really took place then. So that today I pray for them every day at church. Every day I do prostration for them.
As it should be. Yeah.
They're dead.
It doesn't matter.
I'm one of those that had an opportunity to fix things with them without them even knowing, in developing a heart and a love. My father responded. My mother, it took a little while, but she eventually did. To Joshua here, I just want everybody to understand that really this whole issue between children and parents can be fixed. It may have to be solely the child, but it can be fixed. And the child really, as an adult, needs to act like an adult and be responsible to Christ and respond to Christ and what he says. If we go on holding a grudge, nothing gets fixed.
That's true.
Nothing changes. And if we want things to change, it has to start with us.
And it's a process, is what you're saying. It might take years, but we have to give effort to it.
And it did.
And praying for a parent or praying for someone who's hurt us in some way is in no way saying that what they did was unimportant, insignificant, etc. It's not saying that at all. It's not saying that what they did was not terrible. But we must love as God loves. If we don't love our enemies, we don't love people who've mistreated us, we can't even pretend to say that we love. So it's a process. So start with prayer. Start with prostrations. If someone is really, really in your heart in a very negative way, then maybe a dozen prostrations, maybe 100.
So what do you say prostration? What does that mean?
You make the sign of the cross, and then you get down to your knees, and then you take your head, your forehead, and touch it to the floor. Near the floor. You'll show.
I did it before Mass today. I didn't know what I was doing.
Like that. Generally, you make the sign of the cross, and then you'll say a prayer with the prostration. I always say, Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy upon so-and-so. Basically my go-to prayer for all the time. And say 3 for some, 1 for others, a dozen for others. Depending on just depending on how I feel, depending on the sort of the level of, not importance per se, everyone is important, but just sort of the level of intensity. So if you really have someone that you really, really have real deep problems with, I think it's very possible that there'll be a lot of terrible things that happen in the future. People taken away from their homes, maybe put in prisons. There's even I don't want to be too political here, but there's literally the idea of people who don't agree with certain leftist ideas, that they're enemy combatants. If you're an enemy combatant, if you're designated an enemy combatant, the government officially says they can do whatever they want with you. They can put you in a hole in the ground and not even tell anybody that you're there. And if a person becomes considered to be an enemy combatant, they become a non-person, basically. Could that happen for regular old people that are just living in any town USA, going to church, going to work, playing t-ball with their kids? I think it could. Now, if it did happen, what are we to do? Hate those that arrested our father, our mother, our brother, our priest? Or are we to organize protests, legal action? Or are we to pray? We at least should pray. Now, maybe there's a legal action, maybe there's a protest, maybe something will happen, but absolutely we have to forgive those who've done the terrible thing. In our own lifetime, this stuff happened. And certainly within the lifetime of our grandparents, this stuff happened in Russia, in Germany, etc. So we have to be able to forgive heinous acts or just things that were really terrible that happened to us when we were kids.
Is this just kind of a love the sinner, hate the sin kind of thing?
Yes, it is, but I think you should even more ardently and with more effort and with more blood try to love the real sinner, the sinner, the one who sinned really bad. Work on them a little harder and pray for them. Pray for people that have really hurt you or that are doing terrible things. That's why I'm not for the death penalty. Because I can't imagine that if somebody killed one of my beautiful grandchildren, that I would say, I want them to burn in hell. I can't imagine that I would say that. I can imagine that I'd be super angry and I'd have burning inside of me, but I would do prostrations for that person.
I find that when you're angry with somebody and you really pray and do prostrations, it's disarming.
Mm-hmm.
It just, you start to look a little more introspectively have I done that to somebody? It changes things.
I was watching this program with Father Alexei from there, and he said a phrase that kind of resonated with me that said a good son is responsible for the sins of their father, in a way that the sins we commit affect other people all the time, right? And then like we say we angry with somebody because of what they've done, and then we have to forgive them. So in a way, you have to take responsibility for what they've done wrong, forgive it by changing how we think about it, by changing ourselves, how we were affected by it, if it's in a negative way. Is that kind of what that means with that phrase, or?
I think so. And I think you can expand that. If you've committed a sin, or a sin has been committed against you, then you could pray for those who have committed such sins. Or, for instance, I've given this example before. Every woman who's had an abortion should pray for everybody who's had abortions. Or anybody who's participated in abortion or gotten their girlfriend to have an abortion or whatever it is, you should pray for those who've had abortions. Because abortion is a gut-wrenching thing. It marks a person, debilitates a person's soul. And we shouldn't want anybody to be debilitated like that. So we pray. if we were, I don't know, fornicators when we were youthful, we should pray for those who fornicate. A person who finds their way away from an immoral lifestyle should pray for those who have immoral lifestyles. So this is an important subject, and we've only gotten a few verses in Matthew, but it really doesn't matter to me how many verses in Matthew we get. We want to learn life is what we want to learn. If you learn life, you learn the gospel, whether or not you have the gospel memorized. St. Mary of Egypt, by the way, was illiterate. She quoted the scripture to Zosimus. And he goes, how is it that you know the scripture, having never learned? She kind of laughed a little bit. It's like, well, God taught it to me. So you can learn the gospel without reading the gospel, but none of you guys. You didn't hear it from me that you don't have to read the gospel. If you can live a perfect life, I give you a blessing to not have to read the gospel. Right? If you have no passions, I don't care if you fast or not if you have no passions.
I was thinking about the story that you told last week, or maybe probably told multiple times, about the guy who said, "Oh, I forgave that person. I just don't think about it."
Oh, yes.
You know.
Well, that's a good thing. That ties into this question about somebody who's hurt you.
So did that for a long time, 4 or 5 years.
You just don't think of somebody.
Yeah.
It's because you haven't forgiven.
I stopped talking to my parents a month ago, and
Yeah.
well, I'm here.
Right.
It's like stopping talking to my parents and so on.
Yeah.
Well, hopefully you can talk to them again soon. But if you can't, then you can pray for them. And not thinking about somebody does not mean you've forgiven them. It's just not true. Because thinking about them just brings up all that anger and everything else. And so you push it all down. But it's still there.
Suppression.
Yeah, suppressing the anger doesn't do anything. By the way, I heard a great definition. It's not always true, but it can be true a lot of times. Depression is suppressed anger. So often depression is suppressed anger. So anger, I told you what anger is, right? Anger is energy, more or less. Anger is where the will has power to accomplish something, because you say, this isn't right. It's not right that there are homeless. I'm going to do something about it. It's not right that I have sins in my heart, and my friends and my neighbors and my family have sins and they do terrible things. That's not right. I'm going to do prostrations for them. Anger makes you do things like that. That's the proper use of anger.
Wrong use of anger brings depression.
The wrong use of anger brings depression, or worse. We just talked about that if a woman's had an abortion, she should pray for those who've had abortions. Of course, in our culture, there are people that wear shirts that say, shout your abortion, and literally make it to be a virtue. But the heart knows that it's not a virtue. And many women have had terrible things happen in their lives. They've lost, oftentimes, if there are married people that have abortions, and sometimes the marriage stays together. But a lot of times, if it's a person who gets pregnant and the boyfriend pushes, they'll break up. The baby dies and the relationship dies. And when the baby would have been born, the mother might, a year later, 2 years, 10, commit suicide. Often suicides are very much connected to when the baby would have been born, or something related to the life cycle of her pregnancy. Or there's promiscuity, or there's drinking, or there's drug use that maybe previously wasn't there. Because there's this wound. And so, if you get a big cut on your leg, you can't just sit there and ignore the cut on your leg, because you start to bleed, and eventually you bleed enough that you die. So you have to fix your leg. You have to put pressure on your leg. You have to go to the hospital, etc. You have to recognize, I have a wound. And our culture says, oh, you don't have a wound. This is a virtue to kill a child. This is a virtue to live in a sexually promiscuous way. This is a virtue to do sexually terrible things. It's a virtue to live in a greedy way. It's a virtue to acquire things. It's a virtue to do this and to do that. But it's not a virtue to do those things. The heart knows. And when you have those things and you don't recognize them, they're going to go somewhere. When you build, these, you go to a zoo or something, or to a circus, and they build these animals out of balloons. What happens when you press on one side of the balloon? The air goes and makes the other side of the balloon bigger. The air is not going away. So if you have sin, it's going to have an effect on you. If you have somebody that's harmed you, that has an effect on you, whether you think about it or not, whether it is part of your daily routine or not, it's going to have an effect on you. You cannot ignore it. That's why I say your prayer should be guided by your life experiences. Whether it's with relationships with people, whether it's sins that you've committed. Every person who was a drug addict must pray for people who were drug addicts. Every person who's had an abortion must pray for people who've had an abortion. And if you have some dysfunction with someone, well, there's other people who have those dysfunctions too. So don't forget that other people are going through the same thing you're going through. So not only pray for you to no longer have this dysfunction with a dysfunctional relationship, but for others as well. Then you start to look outside of yourself. And that's really one of the greatest ways to actually have God come in the heart, is you're not just thinking in your bubble like I talked about, like tunnel vision, only thinking about yourself and your troubles. Because everybody got troubles, let me tell you. And then you pray for people, you give yourself to people, and things get better over time.
How come we tend to blame others for all our shortcomings?
Well, I think the short answer would be pride. We're proud, and a proud person does not want to admit their mistakes. A proud person wants to blame others for their mistakes. A proud person, strangely enough, depends on themselves and is still frightened. Because if you depend on yourself like, I'm the man, I can do everything, experience shows you really can't do everything. Experience shows you that you're really not very good at a lot of it. And so if you depend on yourself as if you are the only reliable person, you're going to fail a lot. So a proud person is actually more frightened, more anxious than another person. I think we see that in our culture today. People are terrified about the pandemic, about disease, about this, about that, about the economy, about the environment, all these things. But the vast majority of these people don't believe in God, or don't really have any, God is not really an active part of their life in any real way. Most people now that are like in college and such, they're the nuns. Have you heard the term nuns? It's like, what do you believe in? What religion are you? None of those. They're none. They don't believe in God really, or they believe maybe in a force, or they believe in chakras, or they believe in crystals or something.
They don't even call themselves atheists anymore.
They don't call themselves atheists?
Yeah, it's just, none.
They're prideful about it. I mean,
They're prideful about it, right. They're
Yeah.
prideful about it. If they have all that going on, they're depending on themselves. Well, if you depend on yourself, you're going to fail continually, because we're weak. We need others. Just recently had a very unpleasant interaction. Somebody was saying, I'm standing my ground, I'm handling my business. This person was not standing their ground and not handling their business. Had the look of a deer in the headlights. The anxieties were standing their ground and handling this person's business. But I can do it all on my own. I don't need anybody.
What I do see this happen. Like you see a person being angry at something because they are, literally really frightened about something that's, happening, and they're doing more disservice to themselves, society, and you find at times it's very hard to step in and interfere in any way, and you just kind of let it, unravel itself, and then it just ends up hurting everybody, and then you were kind of like an accomplice with it, in a way.
I don't know what to tell you. I think everything that we encounter, we should give over to prayer. Your prayer should be pretty long. If you're doing 5 minutes of prayer in the morning, it ain't enough. If you're just whipping through the morning prayers or something, your prayer for others is critically important. We overlook that. We tend to think, I say my prayers from the prayer book, or I read the Psalter. Yeah, for sure. As a warm-up. So warm-up, get yourself limber. So you do some prostrations to warm up, and then you do prostration. You read the Psalter, and then you pray for people. That's the way I do it. It's critically important to give everything over to prayer. People that have problems and that hurt you and everything. That's what we need to do. And then we start to lead whole lives, and we accept that we have no capability outside of God, none whatsoever. So we're getting on in time here. Is there anything else? We've done our requisite 3 verses of Matthew, maybe 4, maybe 5. But this is important to me. This is about life. Studying Matthew, or for that matter, studying Joshua, is all about learning about life. How are we to live? That's the purpose to read the gospel. That's the purpose to read the scriptures. Is it informs you not just about history or about the person of Christ or about dogmas, None of that stuff saves you. Applying that stuff saves you. So if you get anything out of sessions with me, you'll know that you need to do prostrations. You'll know that you need to forgive. You know you need to forgive with effort. Forgiveness is an effort. It's a process.
And it may be lifelong.
It might be lifelong. It might be lifelong. For sure. And God will honor that. If there's someone that you have trouble forgiving, but you pray for them, God will honor that prayer. And eventually, you'll have the ability, maybe not in this life, maybe not, but you'll have the ability to actually wish that person or desire that person to do well more than you do your own child, your own wife or husband, or maybe the same, right? Since God desires everybody the same. I was going to tell you one story at the end. I repeated myself many times about this because, as I told you last time, I really only know a couple things. I just repeat them over and over. So I go to prisons a lot, or I have in the past. I haven't for a while, but I still interact with prisoners all the time. And they have a lot of regret. Most of the guys I interact, they're not like arch criminals or anything. They did something stupid, something hurtful, used too many drugs, etc. And have estranged families, fathers that died while they were in prison, a kid that they went to prison and now the kid's 18 and mad at the world, etc. They have all that stuff going on. So much regret. And what I tell them is this, because it's true, that in the next life, there will be no regrets. There might be memory. I don't know if there is or not. I've never seen, maybe Father Nicholas knows of it, I've never seen an absolute description that's really authoritative of exactly what we know in heaven in terms of about our past. We know our relationships. We will know people that we knew on the earth, we'll know them. But we'll also know people that we never met, like St. John Chrysostom and St. John the Baptist, etc. But as far as the things that happened to us, those things that happened to us, those things that we did, the good and the terrible, will we remember them? I don't know. But I do know this. Dogmatically, this is absolutely true, that we will not have any sickness or sorrow or sign in the next life. So all the things, all the regret that you have now, if you're in the next life with God, with, as it says in the Thessalonians, 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, isn't it? At the end of it, about the coming of Christ, we will be with the Lord. When you're with the Lord, there will not be anything else but the Lord. There will only be joy, there will only be light, there'll be no darkness, there'll be no sin, there'll be no laziness, there'll be no shame, there'll be no regret at all, no matter what you went through in this life. That is true. And that's worth really fighting for.
It's supposed to give us, hope, but it's also kind of a scary thought.
Yeah, I think so. Because we're so unlike that. We're so unlike that. But let's be willing to believe, unlike the people who saw that the girl was dead, and Jesus said she's just sleeping. But their eyes told them she's dead. She hasn't moved for 2 hours. She's definitely dead. But she wasn't dead. So there's dead parts of us, right? There's parts of us that maybe we think, how can we ever animate that part? How can we ever be where we're not with this sin? Or where we can forgive this person? Well, why don't we just believe Jesus? Believe God that those things can actually be rectified. They really can. In the next life, there's no sickness or sorrow or sign, only life everlasting.
Father, one of the reasons I believe that we won't have regret is because we will finally be able to see in clarity what God did to create the silver lining of the dark cloud that you created. And we'll see all the good things that God pulled out of that evil that you did in your life. And we'll look back and see only the good that He did out of the things that you did. And you'll go, gosh, if I had lived perfectly, I wouldn't know that God did these things. But because I lived so imperfectly, I now see how good God is. I now know how He turns everything into good. And so when the apostle says that we're to give thanks for everything because of His goodness, because He can turn everything, we'll be able to do that for sure.
Reminds me of the woman who was anointing the Lord's feet. And He said, she has been forgiven much, therefore she loves me. So she was well aware of her sins and how God had delivered her from her sins. She was certainly a sinner, which means she was a prostitute, but she had been rescued from that. And she was so grateful. And that's what you're describing. Maybe that's the case. I don't really know exactly how it's going to turn out. All I know is it's going to be awesome. Ear hath not heard nor eye seen what it's going to be like. Right? But there will be no regret. I know that.
One of the reasons that I thought that is that someone once said to me that I needed to start regretting all my past. And I started thinking, well, I wish I hadn't done that. And then I thought, but this happened because of that, and this happened because of that. I wouldn't be here if I regretted all those things. And I'm actually better off now than I was when I did them.
Everything happened.
Yeah. Everything happened.
A lot of times a
God's
person
providence.
wouldn't want to undo one thread from the tapestry because, I don't know, I lived terribly, but I have a beautiful boy because of that.
Yeah.
Shouldn't have been doing what I was doing, but I love my boy. Would I not want to have my boy? The history is history, and we don't want to try to change history because that's a fool's errand. You can't change history, but you can order your life according to your history. You can pray according to your history and live according, in defiance to your history, shall we say, in correction to your history.
And that's exactly right. Is that you get to that place where you say, would I do that again? Not today. I wouldn't do that again today. But back then, look what it did, what God did to change, to draw goodness out of the evil that I did.
Right.
It's like the old genie question. The genie comes and says, what's the one thing you would want to change in your life? And every time I mull it over, I always come to nothing, because you can't foresee the consequences of whatever it is you're.
No, you can't.
And that which puts meaning behind forgive them for they know not what they do.
Or even if they knew what they were doing, if they thought they knew what they were doing. Because really, if you're doing evil, you never know what you're doing, right? Because we're not born for evil, we're born for good. So if a person does anything evil, there's some element of ignorance there. Even if they're purposefully doing what they're doing. There's some ignorance there. So even if they know what they're doing, or appear to, it doesn't matter. We pray for people, we live with our eye on eternity. That's all.
I think then that one of the reasons that we are enslaved to our own addictions, or we're enslaved to our own habits, or we're enslaved to certain passions that just grip us, is because we're in torment and we're not forgiving. We're
Absolutely.
embittered against somebody or against something.
Absolutely.
And it may be an embitterment against God Himself. And,
Absolutely. You have to be at peace with people, or striving to be at peace. If you're not at peace with a person, but you're striving to be at peace, that'll work too. But if you're just putting it out of your mind, because that's such an ugly thought, you don't want to think about this. I understand that people have had traumatic experiences that they don't want to relive. I get that. Okay. I'm a priest. I've heard everything. And I know that sometimes trauma is unbelievably just toxic to people. It's something that they can't relive. The brain won't let them go there. I get that. But they know at least there was trauma, right? They know at least there was bad stuff. That's enough to know. You don't have to know the details. You just know it wasn't right the way I was treated when I was a kid, and I'm going to pray for the people that mistreated me. That's enough. I wouldn't advise somebody to try to relive those experiences and somehow, forgive those particular experiences. Don't do that. Just forgive the person. But I have noticed that people who've been traumatized, if they do not forgive, then they are traumatizers. That happens
People
all
who
the
don't
time.
forgive are traumatizers.
What's that?
People who don't forgive are traumatizers.
If a person's been traumatized and they don't forgive,
They become
then
traumatizers.
they become a traumatizer.
they become
People who have become abused, who were abused, become abusive. Now, I'm not saying the same abuse, but in other ways. Maybe some other personality dysfunction. Maybe not as profound as what happened to them. But it's got to come out. That anger will come out if you do not channel it. If you channel it to prayer, to forgiveness, to work, to maybe what you do for your living, what you do with your spare time, volunteering to do whatever it is, if you channel it in that way, then it will not harm others. But if you do not channel your anger, it will harm others. It will. Guaranteed. Because you're radioactive then. You're toxic to others. And you know, radioactivity is invisible. You don't see it, but it still kills. So that type of toxicity still kills. It's really critical. This is one of the most important life lessons we can learn. And I emphasize the word life, like your whole life. Because it takes a long time to learn.
Just one of the other parallels about radioactivity, you'll very often absorb a lethal dose before you even realize it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it kills you through corruption too.
Kills you through corruption, doesn't it? Yeah, all radioactive poisoning really is corruption, right? Breaking down your DNA and etc. So, God bless. God bless. Let's say prayer.